The A note from the Oakbridge Symphony Orchestra hung in the thick, humid Connecticut air, a single, sharp frequency piercing the low murmur of old money and polite gossip. The VIP viewing deck of the Oakbridge Country Club was a fortress of a different kind. It wasn't built with reinforced concrete or blast doors. It was constructed from generation-spanning trust funds, legacy Ivy League admissions, and the quiet, devastating judgments of the local elite. From where I sat in a wrought iron patio chair, I had a clear line of sight to the manicured 18th green, rolling out toward the harbor where the 4th of July barges were already anchored. I did not move. My hands rested lightly on my knees. I focused on a single white sailboat bobbing near the horizon, letting the chaotic noise of the socialites wash over me without breaking my perimeter. True hostility rarely announces itself with a siren. It usually arrives wrapped in a polite smile. 10 feet to my left, standing at the center of a semicircle of deeply tanned executives and their wives, was my grandmother, Eleanor Vance. She held a crystal champagne flute precisely 2 inches from her sternum, her index finger, tapping against the glass in a rhythmic, agitated cadence. She was holding court, and I was the subject of the trial. "It is a tragedy, really it is," Grandmother Eleanor said, her voice expertly modulated to carry over the clinking of ice in heavy crystal glasses. "You raise them with every advantage. You give them the finest education. And what do they do with it?" She paused, allowing the question to hang. Mayor Wilkins, standing to her right with a plate of catered barbecue, offered a sympathetic, tight-lipped nod. Beside him, local socialite Mrs. Harrington leaned in, her eyes hungry for the social currency of a Vance family failure. I kept my breathing even. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. The tactical box breathing technique was muscle memory now, hardwired into my central nervous system. Composure is not the absence of emotion. It is the absolute, ruthless containment of it. "She just sits in a dark room," Eleanor continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction without actually making eye contact. 27 years old, and she plays computer games all day, clicks a mouse, stares at a screen. It's arrested development. I told my son, I said, "Richard, you have to cut her off. You have to force her into the real world, Mrs." Harrington let out a soft gasp of manufactured pity. "Oh, Eleanor, how difficult for you. Has she looked into any clerical work? Something to just get her out of the house?" "I've tried," my grandmother sighed, a heavy theatrical sound that seemed to draw the oxygen out of the humid July air. "But she desperately needs a husband to support her, someone to give her structure, because right now she has no ambition, no drive. She's just drifting." The orchestra's brass section began to warm up, a low, discordant rumble that vibrated through the wooden planks of the VIP deck. It sounded remarkably like the ambient static on a secure comms line right before a high-priority transmission. I did not shift my weight. I did not cross my arms defensively. I simply observed the variables of the room, the shifting weight of the mayor as he prepared to offer unsolicited advice, the calculating gaze of the socialites evaluating my worth and finding it utterly bankrupt, the flushed, righteous indignation on my grandmother's face as she systematically dismantled my character in front of the 50 most influential people in the county. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous. They are just the most exposed. Years of service had rewired something fundamental in me. Even in unfamiliar places, my body still defaulted to readiness. Stillness first, awareness second, movement last. My family saw my silence as submission. They saw my rigid posture as the awkwardness of a failed daughter who didn't know how to socialize. They didn't understand that when you are under observation, every micro-expression is data given to the opposing force. "Look at her!" Eleanor's voice pierced through the brass section, dropping the pretense of speaking behind my back. She pointed her champagne flute directly at me. The liquid inside swayed but did not spill, just staring into space, completely detached from reality. It breaks my heart to see what she's become. One by one, the heads of the town's wealthiest families turned toward me. The conversation on the deck died down, replaced by the unified oppressive weight of their collective judgment. They looked at my simple civilian clothes. They looked at my lack of jewelry. They saw exactly what Eleanor had painted for them, a lost, unemployed dependent wasting her life on meaningless distractions. I felt the heat of their stares, a physical pressure on my skin, but my heart rate remained at a steady 60 beats per minute. I let the silence stretch. I let them commit entirely to their assumption. I didn't look away from the darkening sky, even as the town's wealthiest families turned to stare at the ultimate disappointment of the Vance family. Because in my line of work, The first rule of survival is letting the enemy think they have the upper hand. To the 50 pairs of eyes currently fixed on me in the stifling Connecticut humidity, I was simply Elena Vance, the prodigal failure. I was the inexplicable anomaly in a bloodline defined exclusively by aggressive corporate acquisitions, hedge fund management, and offshore tax shelters. They looked at my posture, straight, hands rested, unmoving, and mistook my discipline for the frozen panic of a woman who had ruined her life. In reality, I am Captain Elena Vance, 03, United States Space Force. My operational home is Schriever Space Force Base, located 12 miles east of the city limits of Colorado Springs. My assignment falls under the Orbital Defense Squadron. There are no windows where I work. There is no natural sunlight, no fresh air, and certainly no crystal champagne flutes. There is only the hum of server racks, the glow of multispectral telemetry screens, and the heavy, continuous burden of global security. People who have never defended anything larger than their own bank accounts rarely understand those who do. The disconnect between my family and me did not happen overnight. It was a calculated, deliberate extraction on my part. 5 years ago, at the age of 22, I sat in a mahogany-paneled boardroom at Vance & Sterling Securities in Manhattan. My father slid a heavy leather-bound folio across the polished table. It contained the legal instruments necessary to activate my access to a generation-skipping trust valued at $14.2 million. Alongside it sat a brass key to a corner office on the 48th floor overlooking Central Park. I didn't sign the paperwork. I didn't take the key. Instead, I had my own legal counsel execute a formal irrevocable renunciation of interest, legally severing my right to the family capital. Then I enlisted. 2 years later, I earned my commission as an officer. Comfort is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the instinct to serve until all you care about is your own preservation. The fallout from that day in the boardroom was absolute. To the Vance family, I had committed high treason. While my cousin Julian was closing on a $4.2 million penthouse loft in Tribeca, I was navigating basic military training in Texas. While my sister was being fitted for a custom Vera Wang gown for her Hamptons wedding, I was pulling 72-hour shifts inside a heavily guarded, sensitive compartmented information facility, a SCIF, buried behind 3 layers of biometric scanners and reinforced steel vault doors. In the SIF, the air is dry, heavily filtered, and meticulously temperature-controlled to keep the hardware from overheating. My daily reality consists of space domain awareness. My unit tracks the trajectory of thousands of pieces of orbital debris, micrometeorites, and, most importantly, the classified maneuvers of adversarial satellites moving at 17,500 miles per hour in low Earth orbit. A single miscalculation on our floor doesn't mean a drop in quarterly profits. It means the loss of early warning missile detection for the entire Western Hemisphere. Distance from the civilian world isn't a byproduct of the mission. It is a fundamental requirement. The only person in my family who would have understood the choice I made was my grandfather, First Lieutenant Arthur Vance. He served as a B-17 navigator in the U.S. Army Air Corps during the Second World War. He held the Distinguished Flying Cross. When I was a child, he never spoke to me about stock portfolios or country club memberships. He spoke about coordinates, about duty, and about the terrifying, clarifying weight of keeping the men beside you alive. When he passed away, the Vance family lost its compass and retained only its wallet. They forgot what it took to secure the freedoms they so casually enjoyed. They replaced service with status. And my grandmother, Eleanor, became the chief architect of that new, hollow legacy. She viewed my military service not as a profession, but as a deliberate insult to her social standing. The military to her was an abstract concept, something meant for other people's children, for the working class, not for a Vance. When I couldn't attend Thanksgiving because I was locked down in a classified briefing regarding a Russian kinetic anti-satellite test, she told the family I was sulking in my apartment. When I missed Christmas because of a sudden shift in the orbital trajectory of a Chinese intelligence satellite, she claimed I was between jobs and embarrassed. It is easier for a toxic family to invent a narrative of your failure than to acknowledge the reality of your independence. To her, my silence was proof of my insignificance. She could not fathom that the young woman she was publicly berating held a higher security clearance than the mayor, whose favor she was currently trying to curry. I traded silk dresses for a poly-wool uniform and Sunday brunches for tracking orbital debris. To my grandmother, I was a ghost. To the Department of Defense, I was the only person standing between our military communications grid and complete darkness. The smell of hickory smoke from the catered barbecue drifted across the VIP deck, clashing violently with the sharp floral scent of imported perfumes. Mayor Arthur Wilkins, a man whose entire political career was bankrolled by my family's PAC contributions, cleared his throat. He looked at me with the practiced, sympathetic wince of a politician assessing a public relations liability. Pity from a lesser adversary is not an insult. It is a tactical advantage. Now, Eleanor, the mayor said, patting my grandmother's arm in a placating rhythm, we all find our path eventually. Perhaps Elena just needs a little guidance. My office is always looking for entry-level secretarial help. Filing, answering phones, organizing the city council minutes. It would get her out of that dark room and away from those games. It's a modest start, but an honest one. Mrs. Martha Harrington, adjusting a $40,000 diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, leaned closer. Arthur is right. You know, my nephew spent a year just playing on his computer after graduating from Yale. We finally had to restrict his trust distributions to snap him out of it. It's a modern sickness, really. But a pretty girl like her, she should be focusing on finding a suitable husband, someone established in finance or real estate. The clock is ticking, dear. People who derive their power from who they know are always terrified of those who derive their power from what they can do. My grandmother laughed. It was a sharp, brittle sound that commanded the immediate agreement of everyone in her proximity. A husband? At this rate, we'd have to pay someone a dowry to take her off our hands, Martha. She has zero marketable skills, unless there's a lucrative market for aggressively clicking a mouse and ignoring your family's legacy. I did not defend myself. I did not explain that I hadn't taken a dime of an allowance since I was 18 years old. I just watched the Oakbridge Symphony's brass section tune their instruments, the late afternoon light glinting off the bells of their trombones. It was a beautiful display of coordinated timing. It reminded me of a synchronized orbital burn. You do not interrupt an opponent while they are busy underestimating you. 5 days prior to this picnic, I was securely strapped into a reinforced ergonomic chair on an operations floor 100 feet below the Colorado Rock. The computer game my grandmother was currently mocking was a real-time kinetic collision avoidance maneuver. A piece of defunct Soviet-era cosmos debris, approximately the size of a commercial microwave oven and traveling at 7 kilometers per second, had unexpectedly altered its trajectory. It was on a direct, high-probability collision course with the United States SBIRS, Space-Based Infrared System, satellite in geosynchronous orbit. That single satellite is an asset valued at $2.4 billion. More importantly, it is the keystone of our nation's early warning ballistic missile detection grid. If that satellite went dark, the Department of Defense would be effectively blind to a launch from the Eastern Hemisphere for a critical 45-minute window. It was a zero-fail scenario. True authority never has to raise its voice to be felt. I was the primary orbital analyst on the console. It was my hand on the mouse my grandmother so casually dismissed. Under the direct high-stakes authorization of the Joint Space Operations Center, I was tasked with executing a highly classified thruster burn protocol. I had to calculate the precise delta V required to alter the satellite's orbit by mere kilometers, just enough to let the shrapnel pass harmlessly through our telemetry zone without depleting the asset's limited fuel reserves. The maneuver took 6 hours of uninterrupted, agonizing mathematical precision. I did not eat. I did not stand up. The stress of managing a multi-billion-dollar military asset moving in a frictionless vacuum is a physical weight that permanently alters your posture. Yet here, standing on a wooden deck stained with spilled champagne, I was being dressed down by a woman whose greatest crisis that week was a delay in her country club membership renewal. She demanded respect simply because she was older and wealthier, utterly ignorant of the fact that the blanket of security allowing her to drink champagne in peace was maintained by the granddaughter she despised. If you're enjoying the story, please hit the like button and subscribe. It helps me share more of these classified files with you. Now, let's get back to the VIP deck. I took a sip of my iced tea, letting her laughter hang in the humid July air, knowing that the computer game I played last week kept the very GPS guiding her luxury SUV from going dark. The rich, heavy smell of roasting meats from the commercial smokers drifted over the railing, a thick sensory layer added to the humid evening. I remained perfectly still in my wrought iron chair, a silent satellite in a noisy, decaying orbit. My cousin Julian sauntered over from the bar, a fresh gin and tonic sweating in his manicured hand. He wore a linen suit that cost more than my monthly base pay as an O3. He leaned against the railing, flashing a veneer-perfect smile. "So, Elle," Julian smirked, swirling the ice in his glass. "Did you win your little game yet, or are you still stuck on the same level?" I looked at him. I tracked his pupils, dilated. The gin was already working its way through his system. Discipline is not just the ability to endure pain, it is the capacity to endure ignorance without the need to correct it. I didn't answer Julian. I simply held his gaze until his smirk faltered, the silence stretching long enough to become socially uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, suddenly intensely interested in the slice of lime at the bottom of his drink. Mayor Wilkins, sensing the drop in conversational momentum, stepped back into the breach, mistaking my silence for quiet shame. He leaned forward, adopting the patronizing tone of a mentor rescuing a lost cause. "I am entirely serious about the secretarial pool at City Hall, Elena," the mayor pressed, lowering his voice as if offering a classified state secret. "It's $15 an hour. You would learn basic filing, perhaps how to operate a multi-line telephone system. We all have to start somewhere, and Eleanor shouldn't have to carry your weight forever." He was standing 2 feet away from a commissioned officer who routinely managed secure satellite uplinks with the National Reconnaissance Office, explaining how to use a telephone. I felt the familiar, cold pressure of my training lock into place. In an uncontrolled environment, the person who speaks first is usually the one who loses the high ground. I had 3 distinct opportunities to dismantle their assumptions. I could have told Julian that my level involved outmaneuvering adversarial space assets. I could have informed the mayor that my current salary, coupled with hazardous duty and housing allowances, rendered his $15 an hour offer mathematically absurd. I could have produced my Department of Defense identification card and watched the color drain from my grandmother's face. I chose the weapon of absolute restraint. I said nothing. Then the atmospheric pressure on the VIP deck shifted. It wasn't the weather, it was the arrival of hard power. A pair of men in dark, tailored suits wearing discreet earpieces stepped onto the wooden planks. They moved with the unmistakable scanning fluidity of a Secret Service detail. They did not look at the socialites or the champagne. They looked at hands, sightlines, and exits. Behind them walked U.S. Senator Robert Hayes. As a ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Hayes was the apex predator in any political ecosystem. He was a man whose signature authorized trillions in defense spending. I knew from the local intelligence briefing, more commonly known as the Oak Ridge Country Club newsletter my mother forwarded me, that he was in town for a private $40,000 per plate fundraiser at the yacht club later that evening. Stopping by the public 4th of July picnic was a calculated 5-minute optics maneuver. The reaction from the local elite was instantaneous and chaotic. Panic is the byproduct of weak preparation, and I watched an entire deck of millionaires panic simultaneously. Grandmother Eleanor practically dropped her crystal flute onto a passing waiter's tray. Mayor Wilkins smoothed his tie, his face instantly reconfiguring from patronizing local official to desperate sycophant. The semicircle around me dissolved as the town's elite scrambled to form a welcoming gauntlet, eager to pitch their zoning issues, tax complaints, and legacy projects to a man who possessed actual federal authority. I remained seated. I did not smooth my clothes. I did not adjust my posture. I simply watched Senator Hayes break the threshold of the VIP deck. He was a large man, carrying the heavy exhaustion of Washington, but his eyes were sharp. He began the mandatory ritual of shaking hands, nodding politely as the mayor descended upon him, instantly attempting to monopolize his attention. Eleanor was right behind him, preparing her most charming aristocratic smile, ready to introduce herself as the matriarch of the county's most important family. The senator was barely listening. He was scanning the deck. His detail was doing the same. When you hold a defensive perimeter, you do not move to engage the target. You let the target come into your zone of control. I watched his trajectory. I calculated the precise moment his line of sight would intersect with my position in the corner. I did not wave. I did not stand yet. I simply waited. Before we see what the senator does next, drop a comment below and tell me, how would you have responded to the mayor's job offer? I read every single one. In orbital defense, you learn not to react to the first anomaly on the radar. You wait, you verify, and you let the target commit to its trajectory before you counter. Mayor Wilkins extended his hand, aggressively stepping into the senator's path to execute a flawless political intercept. "Senator Hayes, Arthur Wilkins. We are deeply honored that you..." "Good to see you, Arthur," Senator Hayes said, his voice a low rumbling baritone. But he didn't stop. He didn't take the mayor's extended hand. He stepped around the politician with the casual efficiency of a man navigating around a misplaced piece of patio furniture. Grandmother Eleanor immediately saw her opening. She stepped forward, her posture rigid with aristocratic pride, pulling her shoulders back to present the perfect image of high society grace. "Senator, I am Eleanor Vance. On behalf of the Vance family, we are so." Senator Hayes didn't even look at her. His eyes had already found their target. True authority operates on an entirely different frequency, deaf to the static of desperate flattery. He pushed straight past the matriarch of Oakbridge society. He left her standing mid-sentence, her champagne flute hovering awkwardly in the humid air. The senator's handlers and the Secret Service detail smoothly parted the crowd, creating a direct, unimpeded path toward the shadowy corner of the deck, toward the unemployed dependent, toward me. I stood. It wasn't a casual civilian rising. It was the sharp, controlled ascent of a commissioned officer recognizing a senior government official. Muscle memory took over. Heels together, spine perfectly aligned, shoulders drawn back, chin parallel to the deck, hands blade straight at my sides. Just as I reached full height, the conductor of the Oakbridge Symphony raised his baton sharply, cutting the brass section off mid-note. The sudden, absolute silence of the band created a vacuum on the crowded deck. Into that heavy, humid vacuum, Senator Hayes's voice echoed like a mortar round. "Captain Vance." In a room full of people pretending to be important, undeniable competence strikes like a kinetic shockwave. He closed the final few feet, bypassing a stunned Mrs. Harrington, and extended a massive, heavy hand. I took it, delivering a firm, professional grip. He shook my hand vigorously, his face breaking into an expression of profound, genuine relief and respect. "I didn't know you'd be here," the senator boomed, his voice carrying effortlessly over the frozen socialites. "Your briefing on the orbital defense grid in D.C. last month was masterful." "Absolutely masterful. I was just discussing your threat matrix analysis with the Secretary of Defense on Tuesday." "Thank you, sir," I replied, my voice steady, my volume modulated to standard briefing protocols. I did not smile. I simply held his gaze, just maintaining the watch. "Well, you maintain it better than anyone in the squadron," Hayes said, clapping his left hand over our handshake. "We sleep soundly knowing you're on the watch, Captain." The VIP deck went dead silent. The destruction of a false narrative does not require an explosion. It only requires the introduction of an undeniable fact. It was a profound, suffocating quiet. The high-pitched clinking of ice had ceased. My cousin Julian's gin and tonic was suspended halfway to his mouth. Mayor Wilkins looked as though he had just swallowed a live grenade, his political calculus short-circuiting in real time. But it was Grandmother Eleanor who suffered the most catastrophic structural failure. I watched her from my peripheral vision. Her jaw had literally dropped. The carefully constructed mask of aristocratic superiority evaporated, replaced by the pale, slack-jawed horror of a woman who suddenly realized she had been standing on a landmine for the past hour and had just heard the click. The paradigm shifted in a matter of seconds. The loyalty of the elite is entirely transactional, and the socialites instantly recognized the presence of federal authority validating my existence. Loyalty based on status is as volatile as unsecured ordnance. It will detonate the moment the wind changes. Mrs. Harrington immediately pivoted away from my grandmother. She stepped eagerly toward me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate need to be close to the new center of gravity. "Alina, darling, I always knew you were involved in something brilliant." "Classified work? My goodness." Within 30 seconds, Eleanor Vance was standing entirely alone. The flock of wealthy sycophants had physically abandoned her, turning their backs on the Vance family matriarch to crowd around me. Their voices overlapped in a desperate, panic bid to ask about my work, my security clearance, my life in Colorado. They were terrified of being on the wrong side of Senator Hayes's favor, and I was suddenly the gatekeeper. I remained completely calm. I did not gloat. I did not cast a victorious look at my grandmother. I simply maintained my perimeter, answering their frantic questions with polite, classified non-answers. The woman they had just dismissed as an unemployed gamer was suddenly the center of gravity in a room full of millionaires. And I hadn't even introduced myself. The morning after the fireworks, the air around the family's quiet vacation cabin was thick with dew and absolute silence. It was 0530 hours. The sun had not yet crested the tree line, leaving the world wrapped in a cool, gray stillness. I stood on the wraparound wooden porch holding a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee. The heat seeped through the thick clay, warming my hands. At my feet, my golden retriever Radar pressed his warm weight against my shin. He let out a low, contented exhale, his tail thumping once against the floorboards. Victory without discipline is just ego dressed up in a uniform, and I had no interest in parading mine around. I hadn't stayed at the Oakbridge Country Club to bask in the sudden, manufactured admiration of the town's elite. Once the initial shock of Senator Hayes's greeting had settled, the socialites had swarmed me, their eyes wide with a desperate hunger for proximity to power. They wanted classified anecdotes. They wanted to know if I could introduce them to the senator. They wanted to rewrite the last 5 years of their condescension in a matter of seconds. I gave them nothing. I politely excused myself, citing an early flight back to my duty station. I didn't wait to see if Grandmother Eleanor recovered her composure. I didn't wait for Mayor Wilkins to withdraw his $15 an hour job offer. I simply walked off the VIP deck, leaving them to navigate the awkward, smoking crater of their own ruined assumptions. A battlefield defined by vanity is not a hill worth dying on. You secure your perimeter, and then you extract. Now, breathing in the damp morning air, the events of the previous evening felt entirely disconnected from my reality. Down in the damp grass, Radar trotted off the porch. He buried his nose in a patch of clover, investigating a charred wooden stick left over from the night's celebrations. A faint breeze carried the sharp, acidic smell of sulfur from the spent sparkler up to the porch. It was the smell of temporary manufactured awe. A flash of bright light, a cloud of smoke, and then nothing but a burned-out piece of wire. It was the perfect metaphor for the world my family inhabited. True power does not require a grand display to prove it exists. It operates silently, sustaining the infrastructure that allows everyone else to sleep. I took another slow sip of the dark coffee, turning away from the yard to look back into the cabin. My olive-drab canvas duffel bag sat by the door, perfectly packed. Inside were 3 sets of operational camouflage pattern uniforms, tightly ranger-rolled to maximize space. My steel-toed boots were secured at the bottom. My flight suit, patched with the insignia of the Orbital Defense Squadron, was folded with mathematical precision. The contrast between the heavy utilitarian gear in that bag and the delicate silk dresses and boat shoes of the country club was stark. It was the physical manifestation of the choice I had made in that Manhattan boardroom 5 years ago. I had traded a life of effortless, insulated luxury for a life of relentless, invisible consequence. Ego is a liability in a firefight, and it is equally destructive in peacetime. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my fleece jacket. It was a single, encrypted text message from my squadron commander, Colonel Miller, back in Colorado. Delta V shift verified. Asset trajectory stable. Good work, Captain. See you at 0600 on Monday. I read the message twice. There was no exclamation point. There was no excessive praise. It was simply the quiet, factual acknowledgement of a mission accomplished from a superior officer who understood the exact weight of the job. It meant more to me than 1,000 hours of applause from the VIP deck. It meant the $2.4 billion early warning satellite was secure. It meant the grid was intact. It meant my watch was holding. The most profound validations in life do not come with a crowd. They come in encrypted text messages and quiet sunrises. I finished my coffee and set the ceramic mug down on the wooden railing. Radar trotted back up the stairs, shaking the morning dew from his golden coat, ready to move. I reached down, scratching him behind the ears, letting the grounding reality of the morning anchor me before the long flight back to Schriever Space Force Base. My grandmother and the socialites of Oakbridge would likely spend the rest of the summer dissecting what had happened on that deck. They would try to contextualize my rank, my clearance, and my sudden authority within their narrow, status-obsessed worldview. They would never understand that the power they suddenly respected wasn't something I possessed to impress them. It was a shield forged entirely to protect them, whether they deserved it or not. Respect isn't something you can inherit or marry into. It's something you build in the dark, long before the fireworks ever start. The content on this channel consists of fictional stories created for storytelling and entertainment. These narratives are not intended to represent real individuals, organizations, or events. All visual elements are for illustrative purposes only. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been dismissed by the people who should have believed in you most, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. There are more stories ahead. Subscribe and stay with us.